Okay, so the question is whether the sense of accomplishment, which we could call some kind of pleasure, right, some form of happiness, that comes from becoming more and more expert in playing a musical instrument.
Or a sport or intellectual.
Okay. Sorry? Okay. Or sport is another possibility. Well, one thing is the pleasure it might give to other people would be another. So it's not just one thing, right? We're not talking about one thing here. When you talk about, it gives pleasure probably to himself, a pleasure which increases, and I'm sure that it gives a lot of pleasure to other people. That's another question, actually, isn't it? I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but it's a different question. It would be the same question. That would be the same question as does the pleasure of music, or does is music the suffering of change? Is the pleasure of hearing music the suffering of change? And if it is, does it last? Does it increase or not? So if we think about this person, this great musician. Okay, so number one is you're saying that this is something which is suffering of change.
I'm wondering if the pleasure of accomplishment is suffering of change, or is it actually maybe a wisdom?
Okay, so that's actually that's more like it really, because of course, when you're asking yourself this question, is it true that the suffering of change is always going to have those two characteristics? It's not going to increase, and it's not going to last. Well, of course, all sorts of examples might come to mind, and the first question is always, of course, well, actually, is this the suffering of change? Because if it's not suffering of change, it's irrelevant, isn't it? It's irrelevant to the question of whether everything which is the suffering of change is, has those two characteristics. So, is it the suffering of change? Okay, so we have to be talking about the pleasure that this person derives from being so good at his art or sport. Okay. So is that the suffering of change? What does anybody think? Is there anybody here that has a thought on that? Yes? Now you got your work cut out because it's over here.
Just do some jogging.
Yes.
Pleasure of running.
Well, eventually that person would get old and aged and not be able to play the music as well.
Yes.
So that would change.
Well, that's the change part.
Yeah.
The question is it like an example of the suffering of change? The pleasure that they experience from getting, from being so good at playing this music or kicking the ball around?
Yeah. Well,
is it the suffering of change?
I would imagine, well, from my side, my experience of being an artist or doing things like that is that I sometimes get great pleasure from what I do well, and sometimes not so pleasurable.
Yes.
So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes. Still, we have the question: is it the suffering of change? It is the suffering of change. So, does everybody agree that the pleasure you get from being good at playing music or being good at sport, I guess we could say being good at anything. So exactly, you see, we've got this. The definition of suffering of change, right? Is that what you're asking? So exactly, you see, we're trying to meditate on whether everything which is a suffering of change, Rinpoche says doesn't increase, doesn't last. So we're trying to find something which does increase and does last. And we don't even know what the suffering of change is. How can we meditate on this without knowing what the suffering of change is? Yeah?
I seem to recall that there were some mental skills that probably are virtuous, that if they increase You look at people who have been reborn and have what we would generally call talents. Somebody like a Mozart, who at a very young age is able to create, just amazing compositions. And a lot of people might say that perhaps these were skills that he acquired in previous life. And so I'm wondering if this is a skill set, or this level of accomplishment is maybe more of a wisdom consciousness of some kind, even though it's mundane, and it therefore increases and does not decrease, or is it the suffering of change? How does one define that?
And are they necessarily contradictory? So the question of how the skill was arrived at is one question. Then the question of the pleasure that the person experiences. This is what we were talking about, wasn't it?
Well,
Is that the suffering of change or not? So what we seem to have reached the conclusion, we don't know what the suffering of change is. Does anybody know what the suffering of change is?
I don't know, but I would.
Where are you?
I'm here. In the back.
Oh, okay. No, I don't. Where?
Um,
Who am I listening to?
Here, right over here.
Okay, yes. Gotcha.
I don't know, but my assumption would be that when we talk about the suffering of change, we talk about one continuous activity. And if that increases infinitely, or if it stops somewhere and it turns into suffering. Is that correct?
That would be the question, yeah. But as for what the suffering of change itself is, what does it mean, suffering of change? What does suffering of suffering mean?
It turns from what we experience as happiness into suffering.
That's what Rinpoche was saying. He was saying the suffering of change doesn't increase and it doesn't last. But what is the suffering of change that doesn't increase and doesn't last? Sensation of pleasure. Did you say cessation? No, I think she said sensation. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Sensation of pleasure.
Okay, so the
Among
suffering
the
of...
three types of sensations.
So I didn't get the last bit.
Among the three types of sensations.
Okay, so we've
The
got three
pleasurable
kinds of
one.
sensation. You've got pleasant sensations, unpleasant sensations, and neutral sensations. And you're saying that the suffering of change is the pleasant sensations.
Yeah, maybe.
So any pleasant sensation is the suffering of change?
Have to check.
Go for it.
It's
go
a
on.
proposition. It's a proposition.
What's your proposition?
My proposition, my proposition for the definition of suffering of change.
You
So
was,
we have
okay,
to
so
investigate.
yes. That's what I'm doing. You're trying to slip out of that. So how about that then? We're going to kind of define the suffering of change as pleasant sensations. How does that
Steve?
work? Yes?
Yesterday, Rinpoche said that any pleasure you feel is because you create the causes in the past life.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's true, yeah. For sure, any pleasant sensation, pleasant feeling anybody experiences is going to be the result of causes, something that you built up somehow.
Isn't all
Just a
happiness
second.
that we experience the suffering of change?
Isn't that the same as what Venerable Chantal was saying? Yes?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. So it's more or less the same. And then we've got somebody down the front who wanted to contribute.
Yesterday, Rinpoche said that the suffering of change is also the pleasure that you feel here in the samsara. And sometimes this pleasure, it's the beginning of another suffering that you will feel.
Okay, thank you, yeah. This is all great. Now I've got a question. Does the Buddha experience pleasure? Yeah. The Buddha experiences pleasure, hopefully. Right? So is that the suffering of change? I think, yeah. So we've got somebody over here saying no, because it's not contaminated. Right? Yeah, I mean the pleasure that a Buddha experiences, or an arhat, or anybody who's completely beyond psychic existence, we wouldn't call that the suffering of change, would we? So they do usually say contaminated pleasant sensations or happy feelings. Contaminated, okay? So that's now it's all clear, isn't it? Now it's all clear. Yes?
I think there's a difference between pleasure and happiness.
Uh-huh.
And I think that if we're confusing the two at this stage, then we're confusing the conclusion we're going to reach.
So what's the difference between those two, pleasure and happiness?
I'm not sure, but I think pleasure may be associated with sensory perception, receiving sensory stimulus. And happiness, I mean, if you're talking about a relationship situation, it's not pleasure, it's solely pleasure that we're talking about.
This is really very interesting that you would bring that up, actually. So in the, in the standard texts which describe the different mental factors, one of the mental factors, remember I was saying the other day there's 52 of them, actually somebody pointed out afterwards there's not 52, there's 51, just by the way. So one of them is what they call the mental factor. Well, many people translate this as feeling, but I think I was mentioning before, because that has people get mixed up with, the like emotional feelings, how you feel about something. So it could be better to say sensation. And they talk about three kinds of sensation. There are pleasant sensations, unpleasant sensations, and neutral sensations. Then sometimes they talk about 5 types of sensation. And so when they talk about 5 types, then they're talking about where the extra ones come from is, instead of just saying pleasant sensations, they talk about somehow the pleasant sensations that you get with the sense consciousnesses, like with your physical body and so on, and the happy feelings, happy sensations of the mind. So in other words, probably the mind, mental consciousness is capable of experiencing a pleasant sensation like the senses do. But when we talk about happiness, that's more to do with, that would be exclusively the domain of the mental consciousness and not the sense consciousness. So in other words, the mental happiness that you might experience in a relationship and the physical pleasure that you might from time to time experience during the relationship and in other areas, they're all grouped together as pleasant sensations. So it kind of makes sense, because the mental happiness that you experience, for whatever reason it might be, I mean, I don't know, the joy of mind that watches a child growing, or there are all sorts of things, aren't there? There's something very similar to that is something very similar to the physical pleasant sensations, because both of them are what they describe in the text as satisfying feelings that you sort of. I don't think when it says satisfying feelings, I don't think it's so much to do with because they talk about all samsaric pleasures being ultimately not satisfying, but I think satisfying in the sense of when you experience it, you don't reject it. Your mind kind of sinks into it, or goes into it, as opposed to an unhappy feeling, unhappy mind, or an unpleasant feeling, which by its nature is you push away. And in fact, that's where we get the idea of, or maybe it's that classification of sensations is a reflection of the fact that, as we're always saying, all of us want happiness and don't like suffering. So it's the nature of happiness that when it arises, you're sort of it's maybe you say it's like your mind dissolves into it. There's no, it kind of goes into it. It's kind of like a feeling of that satiates, whereas the unpleasant feelings, just like unhappy feelings, unhappy states, are ones that, you know, it's like the mind doesn't somehow just joyfully go into it. It's like it wants to get away from. So it's naturally something that we don't want. So it's from that point of view that I would say that even though they are different, because the physical, you know, pleasant physical sensations are not the same as like the happiness of the mind that we can experience in, you know, on a more like, I don't know, like almost like conceptual level a lot of the time. They still do have those kind of like characteristics in common. So they can still be, in other words, they can, if we talk about contaminated mental happiness and contaminated, you know, physical pleasure, which are both counted as pleasant feelings. Okay, I don't know where this is going to go, but it seems to me that you could say that in both cases, you know, when they arise, your mind grasps at them, and then can get depressed when they come to an end. So they function very similarly in that way. Even though yes, they are different, but the difference is just because because of the consciousness that they're associated with, really. There was a question up here. Are you okay with that?
Well, could I just?
I'm not okay with that.
Oh, sorry.
Where was that coming from? But no.
Could I just respond to that just
yes.
slightly? Aren't we using the same faculty, or the same inclination, human inclination, in the way that you described this morning, of going through these lifetimes of form and formless, and I'm not too familiar with them,
yes,
but isn't it? Aren't we doing the same thing, as you have just described, in relation to wanting to connect to happiness?
Oh yes, what would drive you to seek those states would be the perception that they are superior, you know, like forms of happiness. Although it seems a little bit odd as you go up to the higher levels where you actually give up on happiness and you just go for the neutral feelings, you know, yeah. But so still, it's a similar kind of thing.
So essentially, our human potential to do this is actually to our advantage. It's just the way we use it.
Yes. Many people, I think, quite mistakenly believe that when we say all sentient beings want happiness and don't want suffering, that there must be something wrong with that. Actually, it's the most natural thing in the world. It's what you do with it that, where you can go wrong. Yeah, there was somebody over here.
You were dividing between sense pleasures and mental pleasure. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how the virtuous mental factors fit into that aspect. So for instance, concentration, which is a skill that you can develop to a very high degree along with some of the other virtuous minds. Mm-hmm. So are these contaminated at the suffering of change?
Well, whether they're contaminated or not is one question. There's the concentration itself is distinct from, as a mental factor, is distinct from the feeling or sensation mental factor.
Because one would assume, for instance, back to the original example of Yo-Yo Ma, that there's a certain level of concentration involved in that accomplishment, and thus the accomplishment gives pleasure. So maybe it's somehow mixed.
Well, I tell you what, actually, I mean, if I leave what I said as it is, it could be a little bit misleading. Though they are distinct, any mind which is characterized by concentration, in other words, has that ingredient of the mental factor of concentration. I don't know if I could say it would always have along with it the mental factor of a pleasant or happy feeling, depending on whether you're talking about the senses or the mental consciousness. And it would be affected by it. So it itself, that concentration itself, wouldn't be the suffering of change. If we're going to say the suffering of change is, like the contaminated, pleasant or happy sensations. Okay, just because it's a distinct mental factor. Still, I mean, it would be valid. It would be quite valid to say that, yes, why not? I'm sure concentration is involved there, and maybe the concentration is enhancing the well-being in the mind. But still, the main point really, I mean, all of this is interesting, but the main point really is, what is the suffering of change? We seem to have reached the conclusion that, I mean, I'm not saying that everybody accepts or believes this, but anyway, there's an idea to work with, that it means contaminated happy feelings. Now we still have to work out what a contaminated happy feeling or happy mind means.
Contaminated, I think, is something strictly connected to aggregates.
Well, there's one problem with that, which is that the
body,
which is that the Buddha has aggregates and the Arhats have aggregates, and they all have aggregates. Really, the aggregates, I mean, okay, you can talk about the aggregates, the 5 aggregates. They all have a body and mind. So, you can't just talk about it in terms of being connected with aggregates. Usually they say, anyway, what does anybody think? Are we getting close to knowing what the suffering of change is? It looks like you can say quite often the way that it's taught, if you keep it sort of simple, it seems to be saying all of the pleasure and happiness that we experience at the moment while we're not actually beyond psychic existence, that's the suffering of change. Like the pleasure you get from eating good food. And it's a lot of the examples actually that are given are all to do with pleasure, these sense pleasures. And they don't talk so much about the like what you might say mental pleasure, anyway, the mental happiness. But still, it's worth having a look at that. Maybe we can leave that for the moment and just look at the sense pleasures, the ones associated with the senses. So somebody has been, yes, Lama's been trying to get that microphone for a while.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you...
You have to hold it up close to the mouth.
I never use it.
Yes.
Can you please, when you were asking the definition of compounded pervasive suffering, what would not be? What would not be
compounded pervasive suffering?
And why?
Well, it's all to do with it's all to do with not having yet been able to free ourselves from psychic existence. So think of anybody that's beyond psychic existence. They are completely free of this pervasive compounding suffering, which really refers to the aggregates or body and mind, which are like derived from or the result of karma and the klesha, in the sense that, like we were saying the other day, ignorance arises, then based upon the ignorance, the other afflictions such as attachment and anger arise, then we create karma. Karma, when it's, there's a particular kind of karma, usually it's quite strong karma, motivated by either very, definite positive minds or the more destructive minds of attachment and anger. So those, in that case, the karma you've created is called throwing karma, and throwing karma means it propels you towards a set of aggregates of a being that's in one of the 6 realms. Okay? So those are, contaminated aggregates, contaminated by the previous karma and mental afflictions. Right? Then,
for example, would shine or emptiness not be compounded pervasive
well,
suffering?
the problem is, anyway, the simple answer to that is you can have real, as Rinpoche, to use the term Rinpoche used last night, fully qualified karma abiding and still be totally stuck in psychic existence without any kind of awareness of the true nature of reality, emptiness or selflessness. So karma abiding, shine or whatever you call it, is no guarantee. Direct realization of emptiness, now there you'd be kind of like, have more chance of being free of the what do you call it, contaminated aggregates.
Thank you.
You've been waiting for a while, haven't you? Yes.
It's about the mental happiness you
Yes.
just mentioned is could be still grasping, right?
Yeah.
How about heartfelt happiness?
Heartfelt happiness.
Right. So can you distinguish these two, and are they still belongs to the one type of consciousness?
Yes.
And
do you think? So can I ask in return? Do you think that we can talk about mental pleasure as well as mental happiness? Are those two both possible? Sort of like a pleasant feeling in the mind as opposed to a happy feeling in the mind, sensation.
Yes.
Happiness in the mind as opposed to pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Give an example then, please. Can you give an example?
Well, it's very simple.
Yes.
You have the type of food you like, you give you a pleasure, but you feel happy about because you connected with your heart.
Yeah.
Maybe your mother has been cooking for you when you're little.
Yeah.
That's that kind of happy, and I don't know. It's just something come up right away.
Yeah. Yeah. So it does seem like when you're enjoying something physically, that mentally you also are you necessarily enjoying it? Not necessarily, actually. It's not necessarily the case, is it? Or is it? I don't know. Like what I'm thinking of is like this. You could be eating your favorite food, but you're grieving because somebody close to you has just died. Would you enjoy the food? There's a no over here. I mean, maybe it seems a bit technical, but for me this seems actually quite important because we really it's really important to work out what this suffering of change is and what contaminated means and all that kind of thing, because otherwise we can't really get the impact of the whole teaching on the 3 types of suffering. So, yes.
Steve.
I'm slower.
I think someone. Aren't we talking about body consciousness, though?
Body,
I mean, for the pleasure, for example, of eating food,
Yeah.
is a pleasure experienced by body consciousness. That's mind.
Yeah, or specifically the taste consciousness.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's the, and possibly tangibility.
Yeah.
That's consciousness. That's mind.
Yes.
So it's, in the end, isn't it all mind?
Yes. And so where are you going with that?
Well, I'm just wondering about the distinction that we've made. You know, that
between pleasure and happiness, kind of
exactly
thing.
Between pleasure is physical, but what does that mean? You know, there's, you know, the
well, it's a physical sensation in the sense of being a sensation associated with or belonging to one of the senses, the sense consciousnesses.
Right. So you're making a distinction between sense consciousness, the 5 sense consciousnesses, and the mental consciousness.
Yes.
And that's the distinction you're making between pleasure and happiness?
Yes. Although I am also asking the question whether it's possible to have sometimes mental pleasure and sometimes mental happiness. Is there a difference? I mean, like, for example, sometimes don't you find yourself sometimes in situations which you're not enjoying, but you're happy with? You're happy about what's happening. You might be doing a job which is really hard and a big worry, but if someone were to ask, are you happy with your life? You might well say, yes, I'm happy. I'm happy to be doing this.
Sure.
And those are both like mental consciousness, aren't they? You're not talking about, you know, how it feels physically, tastes and sounds and so on. It's like a big worry to be doing this job. So, in other words, that's an unpleasant feeling. But you're happy with it because you know that there's nothing better you could be doing with your life. I'm sure a lot of people, that's what keeps them going in their usually underpaid Dharma jobs. Yeah. How are we doing for time, by the way? Namsa.
Venerable Steve. Hello.
Yes.
I'm having trouble connecting contaminated pleasure and suffering of change with one of my favorite activities, and that is gallery going. It seems to me that when I go to my favorite galleries and see the same paintings over and over again, it seems to me that the pleasure increases even when I'm not in the gallery. My remembrance of the painting brings pleasure. So I'm having difficulty seeing how that can be associated with contaminated pleasure and suffering of change.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thank you, yes. I wonder if anybody has a sort of thought about that first. You have about that? About what the lady back here was saying?
Well, about what contamination is, which I think is what we've been sort of circling around.
Okay, yeah.
Well, a contaminated action is an action performed through ignorance or under influence.
Yeah.
And the result of a contaminated action is a contaminated feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we have contaminated happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And we all so every happiness that we experience is contaminated.
So now, can you connect that with what this lady at the back was saying? The gallery viewing?
I'm not sure. Well, my initial thought on that is that if she actually viewed the gallery for hours and hours and went into the night and into the next day, it would start to wear thin. Mm-hmm. I think maybe each time she's experiencing a new pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
So a new contaminated happiness is ripening each time she goes to a different gallery, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. You see, I think he's got a point there because, you know, if you think about how they, you know, the analysis, let's say, that goes with like eating, they say it's the pleasure you get from eating is the suffering of change, because if you were to keep eating, keep on and on and on eating, you end up feeling sick. So now it's not really, and you can see a similarity, can't you, there? The similarity is this, which I can't remember your name. Tony. What Tony was pointing out. If you, let's say there's it's almost like you have to take it piece by piece. If there's a picture that you like, that you derive some kind of peace or pleasure or satisfaction from watching, how about standing there and just watching it and watching it and watching it and watching it? Of course, nobody does that. You go and you have a look a bit, and then you go off. Actually, why do you stand there and watch for a while and then go on to another picture? Because you get fed up. But in any case, that if you think about it, if you use the same analysis as with the food, and like sitting in the sun, you feel cold, so you go and sit in the sun. If you sit there long enough, it might seem to you that this is good in the beginning, but if you have to keep sitting there, you get hotter and hotter and hotter, and it gets worse and worse, and you've got to change. So therefore, it's the suffering of change. It's something that seemed nice in the beginning, but it changed.
But that's
and you ended up with
because of
suffering.
attachment.
So in the same way, if you were to keep watching this, if you had to stand there and just keep watching the picture, would you feel more and more and more happiness? Eventually, you'd get tired of standing there.
But that is attachment, and I mean, you don't, like you said, you don't stand in front of a painting
Well, things you could
all
say
the
that about
time,
anything.
but you do keep going back to paintings. You learn about them, and therefore your enjoyment increases. No one, I mean, it's.
Well, first of all, there's no guarantee that it would. But even if it does, that's not really what we're talking about here, because you can say the same thing about food. You can go to one restaurant after another, and you keep enjoying yourself. I mean, of course, there's no guarantee that you're going to enjoy yourself every time, just in the same way that there's no guarantee that you're going to enjoy yourself every time you go to a gallery. But, you eat and you enjoy it. And most people, they have a sense of where they have to give up. Actually, most of us don't have a very good sense, because that's why we also overweight. But, you have that at a certain point you're beginning to feel a bit uncomfortable, and most of us don't really think about it. You start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, so you're full, so you stop eating. I mean, you come back the next day for another meal and so on. But the analysis is, if you sit down to eat, if you think that's real pleasure, try eating and eating and eating. You carry on and on and on, and you see that actually it turns into suffering. That's the point they're trying to make. That happiness is not real happiness, because if it were real happiness, this is what they say. If it were real happiness, then if you were to carry on eating, you would get happier and happier and happier, or the pleasure would become more and more intense. It would only increase, but it doesn't. There's a point where it turns to suffering, and we know that very well, don't we? Short term, there's the pain, and long term, there's the suffering of the cholesterol and the blood pressure and stuff like that. So just like that, we're not talking about how it is that you enjoy going to one gallery, then you enjoy going to the same gallery maybe the next day or a few days later, and going to another gallery. It's looking at one picture. Mm-hmm. You're standing there, and you're standing there. Could you just stand, if it's real happiness there, if that's real happiness, it should be that if you stand there and stand there and stand there, the happiness is going to get greater and greater and greater. That's the analysis that they're doing.
But I think that is conceivable with visual arts.
I'd like you to try it.
I would, well...
No, really, I'm not making fun, right?
No,
you
but
try
I'd like to know where does suffering of change end and start, and where does attachment end and start? It seems to me that you're talking about attachment, like when you get so grasping of that pleasure that it begins to sicken or bore you, or dull your mind, in fact.
Well, actually, I would say that attachment is certainly connected. It's all involved there. Nevertheless, that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the sensation, the pleasant sensation. We're looking at the pleasant sensation you experience from the food. And in the case of, the mental realm, the realm of mental happiness and joy and so on, the same thing. We're looking at the pleasure there, or the happiness there.
The case is less effective for me personally when it involves a kind of mental pleasure, such as appreciating music or looking at paintings. I totally buy it when it comes to things like food and consumable bodily sensory things, but it becomes difficult for me when it involves apparently benign mental pleasures.
Yeah. Actually, I totally agree with you, I must say. I mean, it's with the mental happiness and pleasure and so on that it's not so straightforward. But I wouldn't say that, it's still worth thinking about.
I was actually just thinking that part of the analysis is the idea that we believe the object is the source of the pleasure. So if we think the music is the source of our pleasure, then it should increase the more we listen to it. So whether it's a mental object or a sense object, well, I guess that is an object, isn't it? Don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yes. Yeah.
So even intellectuals, even talking about Dharma can become an object of pleasure.
Well, yes. I mean, we're going to certainly have that kind of question arising in our minds. When it comes to like the happiness that you begin to experience as you start to meditate, is that suffering of change or isn't it? If it's not the suffering of change, then what is it? So suffering of change means the contaminated happiness. Contaminated means like something that's coming from the karma and delusion. So is that happiness that you start to experience through meditating, for example, is that contaminated or not? So then, again, then another question comes up. So is it possible for us who have not yet abandoned the root of cyclic existence and, karma and the delusions, is it possible for us to experience uncontaminated happiness, pure happiness? That means happiness that's going to increase the more and more we do it. Is there anybody here that thinks that if you sit down to meditate and you keep meditating that you're going to get happier and happier? Is there anybody here that's experienced that? So it's, anyway, it's puzzling, isn't it? It's puzzling. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty much what my comment was on that, which was, I mean, it seems like you can divide two things, like the sense pleasure and then the mental consciousness.
Mental happiness, yeah.
Mental happiness, yeah, because the body obviously has a limit based off, as a result of karma and afflictions. It has a limit to how much your stomach can take before it hurts or, you have a problem. But as far as mental happiness, it seems like the dividing line is grasping, and I guess you got to have different multi-levels of grasping, but it seems like even when you're talking about, like just now when we were talking about a spiritual experience, like, I'm sure a lot of us have an experience where if we meditate and then we get some nice feeling from it, but then we come back the next day and we walk away from the meditation and go, oh, I didn't have that nice feeling, and it's a little bit depressing.
You mean like you come back the next day and you don't get the same...
Exactly. Or like you said, you keep meditating and you just get tired, or your mind gets dull and you can't do it anymore. So then, that was more of my comment was, that seems like the suffering of change, but it seems like the suffering of change only because it's still contaminated and there's grasping, and there's grasping on inherent existence, essentially, and it's a conception.
Yeah.
That's why it's suffering.
Maybe.
Well.
I found this little bit, a little bit missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
Is that is the time we go looking after the suffering of change or this pleasurable feeling prevent us from looking at uncontaminated happiness.
Uncontaminated
happiness. So, they are pleasure, they are nice sensation, there's nothing wrong with that. The point is that we spend so much time looking for them instead of looking for permanent happiness or uncontaminated happiness. So often we say, if one is suffering, experience suffering of suffering, one cannot meditate, one cannot grow spiritually. So one needs a certain level of happiness to be even to be able to train the mind, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, but for me, the point is not so much, the suffering of change. Yes, they're just relative happiness, right? So, how not to get attached, how not being consumed by looking for them, and just see them for what they are, and then spend the most important part of our time looking for ultimate happiness, right? By practicing the spiritual path. So for me, it's more, to be obsessed by that. That's the problem. It's not the experience itself. If one sees it for what it is, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. And I think that would be a good note to end on, because I think that really captures it. Yes. Thank you. That brought us down to earth. Okay, so it's 5 to 6, and so we'll stop there. If we dedicate due to this virtue and all of the virtue of the past, present and future of myself and others. And may all beings find real happiness. May the Guru's lives be long, and may all of their wishes be fulfilled immediately. I, the one who am dedicating, am completely empty of existing, inherently empty of existing as something which is not merely labeled. Likewise, the virtue being that I've dedicated, and the act of dedicating